Beautiful like a fresco and fascinating for its idiosyncrasies, Street Fighter III Third Strike is a melting pot of both popular culture and fighting game design. This is the Annotated Third Strike. What the hell is Oro? If we look at the Street Fighter III cast in aggregate, it can be easy to make some assumptions about character similarities. Dudley is a direct reaction to Balrog. Sean is a short-ranged Ryu and Ken. Yin and Yang take Gen and splits him into two. Squint your eyes enough and every new character introduced in 1997's New Generation and Second Impact owes something to what came before it. As stated in this series already, nothing comes from nothing. And though the Street Fighter III games carry a criticism that it featured a cast that was an almost complete departure from the franchise, and that it leaned a little too hard into sci-fi and metaphysical aesthetics, and you can see that this isn't the case. Except for Oro. If Necro is a play on Dalsim and Blanca, and Alex and Hugo are riffs on Zangief, what the hell is Oro? Answer? He's his own thing entirely, made up of disparate parts. Manga tropes, the design team's interest in combat sports, and a thematic twin-like reflection of another series cast member, as is the franchise's unofficial favorite character trick, and he's a lot. He's also a character that plays in a wholly unique way among the mainline Street Fighter games, but with mechanics pulled from other Capcom fighting games. Though his odd appearance may have turned off players in the media that initially glanced at the first true sequel to Street Fighter II's monstrous success, Oro is a character of knowing design. To start, he hails from Brazil. In an interview with the Capcom Fighters Network page, Street Fighter III producer Tomoshi Sadamoto stated that the idea was for a, quote, Brazilian Jiu Jitsu fighter like that Gracie fellow, and his design evolved away from this starting point. The statement has a ton to unpack. First, as a possible Jiu Jitsu practitioner, he likely would have been a close-range grappler, which aligns with Sadamoto's own interest in combat sports and the early Street Fighter III design tenets that were grounded in real-life martial arts, both of which were mentioned in a previous episode. More importantly, though, is that it confirms a long-held fan speculation that Oro's appearance is based on Helio Gracie, one of the founding fathers of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, which evolved into what we now commonly refer to as Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. This is something that we'll circle back to. Jiu-Jitsu as a starting point for the character is significant. According to sources on Wikipedia, the first writings on the fighting system were found in circa 710 as a way to counter armed attackers with long swords and spears, either unarmed or with small weapons. Though the form has grown and evolved through the centuries, particularly during Japan's feudal period, its focus on grappling, throwing, and sometimes ground fighting is primarily used to turn an opponent's weight and aggression against them, which makes sense given that the term jiu-jitsu often translates into wielding art. But jiu-jitsu is still a blanket term for many different forms of Japanese grapple fighting, including offshoots such as sambo, aikido, and judo, which were developed relatively recently given their mother style's age. Jiu-jitsu and judo had a slow expansion of popularity throughout the world in the late 1800s and early 1900s, particularly after 1903, when railroad executive Samuel Hill invited famous judoka to the U.S. to train. When this spread to Washington, D.C., an American judo trainee named Theodore Roosevelt invited his instructors to teach at the U.S. Naval Academy. Seizing an opportunity, the U.S.-Japanese legation requested other strong judoka from the motherland to immigrate to the U.S. to train Westerners, hold exhibitions, and open schools. One of them was Mitsuyo Maeda, who lived and worked on the Western Hemisphere until his death in 1941. Maeda was one of the many Japanese immigrants to eventually settle in Brazil. Teaching judo and working with the various foreign nationals that immigrated there, he opened various schools and participated in early forms of what we now consider mixed martial arts and other title fighting. During this time, a young Helio Gracie, peeking in on his politician older brother as he trained, eventually took on the form himself. As the Gracie family began to train as a unit, the form's emphasis on stand-up grappling and throws gave way to a focus on ground fighting, and this evolution of the style is what we now call Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. The Gracie family not only considered its patriarchs, but also the faces of modern grapple training. Their influence on martial arts over the years cannot be overstated, from the proliferation of their own brand of combat sports to their heavy involvement in the formation of the UFC. Jiu-Jitsu predates most other standardized forms of martial arts, particularly in Japan, by many hundreds of years. This includes even embryonic striking forms like karate, which the most famous characters in the Street Fighter franchise are often said to practice, though sometimes apocryphally. This may tie into one of Oro's most pronounced character traits, his age. Oro is called Senin by more than one character in the Street Fighter III games. In Japanese, this is a term meaning immortal, and evolved from Taoist philosophy. It's often depicted in Japanese culture as an old, sometimes befuddled man. Since characters were no longer given birth years in their bios of the Street Fighter III games going forward, something covered in the Urien episode of this series, we're left to wonder how old Oro really is. Thankfully, Series Bible Eternal Challenge and the Gamist Mook Strategy Guide gives us an exact number as it tells us that he's 140 years old and hails from Japanese ancestry. Since New Generation was released in 1997, this would mean that he was born in 1857. As Brazil has the largest Japanese population outside of Japan, with the first groups of settlers arriving before 1910, he likely arrived with his countrymen and took up his cave residence not long after. We can't know for certain how he does it, but as the turtle in his wind poses can live hundreds of years too, so can Oro. He's also something of a repository for Japanese manga tropes. First, he fills the role of the icky, lecherous old man, though thankfully it's not as pronounced as other characters that carry this trait. He's also prone to falling asleep, which happens in both his match intros and his taunt, which incidentally depletes his stun meter at a rate commensurate with the length the buttons held. The snot bubble protruding from him is the manga equivalent of Z's floating above a sleeping character in Western media. Probably most obvious, however, is that he's the wizened old master found in much of Asian media, and a hermit at that, though he's a teacher without a student. Combined, all of these traits sound curiously similar to Master Roshi, the old pervert that trains various characters in Akira Toriyama's Dragon Ball series, which began publication in 1984. The turtle is likely a reference to Roshi as well, as he's known in the property as the Turtle Hermit. Though these tropes, such as they are, didn't start with Toriyama's dirtbag teacher, he's likely the most widely known to Japanese comics readers, which Capcom design staff clearly are. Oro is in search of a student, and that would-be trainee is series protagonist Ryu. Again, according to Eternal Challenge, Oro is an optimist. His belief that anything is possible has informed his training in martial arts, making him such a powerful fighter he chooses to handicap himself by tying one arm behind his back. As such, he can do things that you and I would consider supernatural, like flying on the wing of an airplane in his second Impact ending. And just as Capcom designers are informed by contemporary comics, they also seem to read their own, as his ending in Third Strike is a direct reference to his training in Ryu Final. But it's this interest in Ryu that motivates him. The long years grew tedious, and his would-be mentorship of Ryu is selfless inasmuch as that he wants to impart what he's learned onto a worthy pupil. If all of this sounds rather familiar, it's because it's a reflection of another character's overall story arc in the franchise, Akuma. As mentioned in his own episode of the series, Akuma has had a Faustian relationship with the series' main character since his appearance and endings in the Alpha series, starting in 1995. As such, Oro represents the angel to Akuma's Mephistopheles. He sees a better nature than Ryu, and surmises that his own inner strength makes him worthy of further growth rather than the easy route that he perceives the Satsui no Hado to be. For further evidence of this, we look no further than his own interactions with Akuma in the rival dial. But Oro does see and respect the strength that Akuma has, which makes sense given that he too can do things no other human can in his endings. Keep this in mind as we discuss Oro's play mechanics in a bit. In many ways, Oro represents the light reflection of Akuma. Think of his bright golden hour endings compared to Akuma's time in the dark and the deep. Take his many special move names, as will be detailed in a bit, for their use of Buddhist imagery in regard to a godlike strength to protect. Finally, consider his use of his secret EX Super, also something expanded upon soon, representing the shining, devastating power of the sun versus the great demon's killing moon. Before the Street Fighter IV games revived Akuma's brother Gouken to be the Onyo Neo de Go-Ki's Yagyo, Oro was the franchise's passive, just, and perhaps dominant representation of deific might. Though he has Japanese ancestry, the name Oro isn't meant to translate into anything in that language, and all of Oro's appearances in Japanese strategy guides spell his name with the katakana alphabet used for foreign words. In ancient Greek, though, Oro can translate to mountain, which may play into his Third Strike ending, but that's a bit of a stretch. More on the nose is his name in Portuguese, the official language of Brazil, where it translates to gold. His Brazilian stage in the game is shared with countryman Sean, but with a subtle change to the tone of the illustration to make it look like it's taking place in the evening. This is likely due to the march of time between Second Impact and Third Strike, where he chooses to leave his cavernous home in search of Ryu. The cave and its many animal friends were his arena in the previous Street Fighter III games. He's voiced in Third Strike by Takashi Matsuyama, a veteran voiceover artist with a sprawling list of credits, including bona fide all-timers like Ghost in the Shell and Princess Mononoke. He returned to the series to voice Oro in Street Fighter V as well as Nakali. He takes over from Kan Tokumaru from New Generation and Second Impact. Something of a voice acting legend, Tokumaru's earliest credits were the original Gatchaman series in 1973, which launched a prolific career until his passing in 2011. Given the breadth and length of both men's careers, calling them the Sennin of the Seiyu isn't far off. As a character in the game, it may be difficult for the average arcade passerby to discern what makes Oro interesting until they reach out to the sticks and use him. What they'll find is one of the most unconventional characters in the overall franchise, from his movement to his overall game plan. Part of this is because Oro is considered one of, if not the worst characters in New Generation and Second Impact. In an oral history with enthusiast website Polygon about the making of New Generation, combat planner Shinichiro Obata states that most of the team behind New Generation had no prior experience producing fighting games, which is ironic given Capcom's hurried output of the genre at the time. Oro is likely a clear example of this lack of prior knowledge. He has a lot of great normal attacks that poke at a decent range, something that maintained through Third Strike, but many of his special moves were disparate. None of what he was able to do seemed to coalesce into a solid game plan. If anything, he was the embodiment of what New Generation's critics often complained about. He was just weird to be weird. The nearly 2-year gap between the release of Second Impact and Third Strike then gave the team, now boosted by overlapping staff from other Capcom fighting games, the time they needed to make Oro not only a viable tournament character, but by many people's estimation, the secret gorilla of the game. Similar in playstyle to Urien in many respects, but still wholly his own, a stray hit from an adept Oro player can begin a sequence that makes even the most skilled parry wielders shrug their shoulders and simper their hands off the stick. Terrifyingly enough, unlike characters with grossly overpowered tools like Yun's Genei-jin, Oro can do it in multiple ways. The main reason, as any Oro player will tell you, begins with one normal move, his standing close medium punch. This is a 2-hit launcher that can be comboed from the first hit, which is something that will play into much of our further explanation going forward. Though not the sole reason Oro is a threat, he's another character that excels by keeping opponents in a juggled state. Keep this in mind going forward too. Of note among the rest of his normal attacks is his standing hard punch, which is a 2-hit overhead. His standing medium kick and hard kick are also some of the best pokes in the game, given their range and the fact that he's off the ground during the medium kick. He has a single target combo with close light kick and close medium kick, but it curiously doesn't combo into anything, while close medium kick normally would. And yes, as a cave-dwelling hermit, Oro has left any sense of decorum long ago, as we can briefly see a specific part of his anatomy during his crouching hard kick. Graphic animator Yuji Imamura stated in an interview in the All About Street Fighter 3 guide that he videotaped himself to use as reference for Oro's movement, and his colleagues teased him to keep his underwear on. Lastly, he's the final character in the game that has a jumping throw, which is handy given the average time that a strong Oro player is in the air. Let's briefly go over his specials. Again, like Urien, Oro is a character that can throw projectiles at different angles depending on the strength of the button pressed. The Nichiren Sho, or Sun Disc Palm, will leave jumping opponents tagged by one in a juggled state, though it can be difficult for the average Oro player to take full advantage of it. The Oniyanma, which Eternal Challenge translates into Demon's Lament, is Oro's anti-air dragon punch maneuver. But since both this and the Sun Disc are charge moves, it's more correct to call it something of a Guile or Remy somersault kick. And like any of those ancestral Street Fighter moves, it's best used as a combo enter than a true anti-air, given Third Strike's parry system. The strength of the button determines damage inflicted, with a hard punch variation hitting twice, and the EX variation hitting 4 times. The Nyoriki is similar to Alex's choke in that it's a command grab that can be blocked like a strike but not parried. While not instrumental to his overall gameplay, this move does a nice chunk of damage and can be comboed into from normals. The name translates into Neo Strength, the Neo being the Buddhist manifestations of strength through both pacifism and force that were briefly described in Akuma's episode of this series, which, again, call to mind Gouken and Oro's opposing those shared nature. The Jinshu Watari, or human sacrifice crossing, is where things get especially nasty. Essentially a jumping foot stomp, the strength of the button will determine the distance traveled while burning EX meter will home in on the opponent. This move is the central tool in what Third Strike players call the chicken wing combo, and is the main extension of Oro's juggle setups. He can also perform this move while jumping. With the right timing, the jumping variation of this move can be used as a very sneaky launcher to complement the close medium punch, or as an overhead for his wake-up game to stomp out opponents at the end of a round. To briefly reiterate the obvious, this series is to dissect characters first and explain why they're used second. For the purposes of this video then, this chicken wing combo is the cornerstone of Oro's gameplay, and was one of the 2 main adjustments the dev team made in between games, as it did not combo previously. This is important as it can now also be comboed into 2 of his super arts, which went from odd curiosities in previous games to devastating utility supers that can rob entire rounds off of opponents. What's interesting is that, on a theoretical level, many Third Strike tournament players feel that it's a specific Oro super that comes out as best practice, again like the Genen or Urian's Aegis Reflector, though most Oro players will swear by one super art or another, switching between them depending on the mood or matchup. Though certainly not the only character in the game with multiple viable options as far as super arts are concerned, his offer arguably more utility, even on an individual level, than it's afforded just about the entire cast. But let's first discuss the one that Oro users will rightly talk you out of, his first super art, the Kishinuki, or Terrible God's Strength. This is an install super that will change his medium punch to augment the Nyoriki command grab and his air throw. In a vacuum, these are fine effects. There's no downside to the super like Makoto's inability to block in her Super 3, and though the meter drain is fairly quick given the long animations of both moves, the player can use them multiple times before the time runs out. Showing his age and relative strength over the whippersnappers that the rest of the cast must be, Oro can also unleash his tied arm to perform an EX variation of this and all of his supers. Using 2 punch buttons to execute this move hops him forward a bit for a command grab that does sizable damage at the cost of the entire meter. The problem is that not only is this not one of his quote good supers, it's not exactly a great one on its own given the setup that can take to use it most effectively, and its one medium-sized meter will limit his EX use. Super Art 2, the Yagyo Dama, or Souls Traveling at Night, is perhaps why Oro is famous in tournament circles. This is an enlarged projectile that travels in different sine wave arcs depending on the strength of the button pressed, and when used by practiced hands is one of the scariest tools in the game. On its own, there isn't a lot to say about it other than the added pressure it can incur on a cornered opponent to guess which direction follow-up attacks may come from, but in conjunction with Oro's further moveset and the rules that Third Strike is governed by running in the background, it's also another move patched out of the revised Third Strike boards like Urian's Aegis Reflector, and for the same reason. Let's explain. As previously stated, Third Strike has an unseen juggle counter running in the background. This means that the more hits a character takes while being juggled, the more difficult it is to continue carrying them, usually ending in 5 to 6 hits. Super moves, though, reset the juggle counter, which players have found devious uses for, such as the Yagyo Dama. If Oro runs through the chicken wing combo and properly places this super as the final hit, while still keeping its movement arc from breaking proper spacing, can give him plenty of time to get over the opponent to place them in an unblockable state. This happens in 2 ways. Again, supers have their own unique properties in this game, and another one of them is that a player knocked down by them cannot quickstand. Moreover, Oro's other major upgrade in Third Strike is that he takes a page from Capcom's Versus games and can employ a double jump in the air. This gives him the necessary spacing tool he needs to land perfectly placed cross-ups while the booger-like projectile is still active. This gives him free reign to go back into another chicken wing combo. And now the worst part. Oro can stock up to 3 of these, which is nice, but given how much meter is gained by a single combo, it is a self-sustaining loop of unblockable super arts if the player can maintain it. Granted, the execution of this sequence has a high skill bar, and the exact movement is character-specific. It is a no-win scenario for all but the best parry-capable players. Of less practical use is the EX variation of this move, executed by 2 punch buttons. Basically throwing an enormous Dragon Ball Z-like sun, it burns a full stock of the meter for high damage and piles of chip, which is where it's generally seen in practice. Closing around with this technique gives Oro a unique win pose. Third Strike Oro is a character whose design was fixed with subtle tweaks to special attacks and the addition of the double jump to give him different movement options compared to the rest of the cast. Though a nearly impossible to break unblockable loop is perhaps a bad example, it's nonetheless illustrative of how deliberate Oro's overall design and kit had been considered in the development period between Second Impact and this game. Iwamura of the development team even acknowledged this shift in overall strength in his comments on the character from the second Gamist MOOC. With all that being said though, Oro's Unblockable was removed from updates in the arcade board just like Urian's. However, fans of the game consider the original Japanese board the accepted way to play the game with those unblockable setups intact. But this, again, isn't the only weapons-grade super he has. Super R3, the Tengu Stones, is another install tool that will summon objects to float around Oro. Normal attacks will trigger them to add hits to the move, and can act as a sort of shield against normal projectiles. The EX variation of this move again causes him to break out his other arm to add more stones at the cost of a faster time at the bottom of the screen. The added stones mean both more damage per hit as well as more stun. In its way, this is not unlike Yun's dreaded Genei-jin in that it causes an opponent to constantly defend against a flurry of incoming attacks. And since the stones are the ones doing the damage, not necessarily Oro's limbs, the lag between a fist and a stone can mean damage coming from both above and below in certain cases. More importantly, it's another crucial ender to the chicken wing combo. By employing it as the last hit the same way one would with the Yagyo Dama, it can take an opponent from coast to coast if Oro himself is backed in the corner, often employing his forward medium punch command normal, and causing substantial damage in the process. As it's a super and adheres to the same rules, it will continue to juggle opponents that haven't hit the ground yet, though to different degrees of use compared to the Yagyo Dama. The damage and stun are important though, in that a single EX stone combo can incur far more than 50% of an opponent's health, and players are still finding new touch of death combos by way of Tengu stone to this day. Respect and fear of Oro has only grown over time. But though he appears at the top of some legendary players' so-called theoretical tier list for the chaos he creates, he's still only considered lesser than the Yuns, Chun-Lis, and Kens of the game. The cited reasoning is that while he floats around the battlefield like a bug, it still takes a well-placed launcher for anything real to take shape. There was an old master who's used to biding his time though. As the competitive life of Third Strike is still evolving with the game's continued renaissance, Oro may yet have his moment in the top tier sun, whether he's hurling it at you or not.